Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome to our Teagasc webinar here this evening. And joining me, my name is Charlie Devaney. I'm Teagasc advisor based in Castlereagh, County Roscommon. And joining me tonight are Ruth Saunders. Ruth is a vet in the working in the National Disease Control Centre in the Department of Agriculture. And also on the webinar tonight is Sean Dorley. Sean is a Teagasc advisor based in Longford, in County Longford. So Ruth will give the presentation on Bluetongue. She'll go through it in detail. And at the end of the presentation, you can put questions into the chat function at the bottom of your screen, and Sean then will deal with the questions at the end. And so all questions, if you put them into the chat function, they will be dealt after the presentation. So Ruth, if you want to start sharing your screen, and you can go live there with your Bluetongue presentation. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Charlie, and good evening, everyone. So as Charlie said, this evening I'm going to give a quick overview of Bluetongue and the situation in Ireland to date. The questions we're going to try and answer, we're going to discuss how Bluetongue spreads and when, which is a really key point in this disease. We're going to look briefly at the clinical signs as to what you should be looking out for. We'll give a quick overview of the current situation, talk about the surveillance strategy, which will include as well vaccination, and then we'll give a quick note on trade and the recategorization of the disease too. So Bluetongue transmission, it's a disease which has about 26 different serotypes of the virus of interest. Currently in Europe, there are about 5 or 6 serotypes circulating, the main ones being 1, 3, 4, and 8, but we've also got 5 and 12 in certain countries. There is a vaccination, as we know, for BTB3, which is here. There's a vaccination for BTB8, and there's also vaccinations for 4 and 12. The transmission is interesting because it's primarily spread by biting midges, what we call the little culicoides midges that we see flying around at the moment. It can also be spread from animal to animals. That can be either through infected semen, for instance, bulls, or through AI, or also through embryos. And there's also a transplacental transmission whereby if a dam is infected when she's pregnant, she can spread it to the unborn calf or lamb, who can then be born with the virus positive in their blood. So, as I said, the main route of transfer is through this vector. And this is a really key piece in the understanding of the epidemiology of the disease. It's a reason why it's incredibly difficult to eradicate, and we'll discuss that further when we're talking about the recategorization, because we know culicoides midges, are everywhere. They're everywhere in the environment. They're incredibly difficult to keep out of houses, and also they spread, as we'll see when it comes to how did this get to Ireland. So in that little midge vector, we've got what's called the extrinsic incubation period. And what happens is a midge bites an infected animal and they take the virus into their blood during that blood feed. It then, though, requires a period of multiplication within that midge in order to develop enough virus in it to transmit it to the next animal it bites. And that piece, that transmission or that multiplication in the midge is entirely dependent on the environmental temperature. So you may hear this 12 degrees bandied about. And the reason 12 degrees is so important, and that is consistent environmental temperature of 12 degrees, not where it goes up for a little bit during the day. It has to be at least 12 degrees for that multiplication to take place. And the warmer it is, the faster the multiplication. So you think in Ireland, where we don't have as warm summers as the continent, that multiplication may take up to 20 days, whereas in much hotter climates, that multiplication can actually take place in 4 days. So that's a really key point in thinking about the viral load in midges in the environment. So what we're currently calling the period we're in is the low vector transmission period. And that's why, because the temperatures at the moment are not above 12 degrees. So the midges remain infected for life, but they haven't been shown to pass on the infection to their eggs. So there is possibility of overwintering of midges, so they can survive throughout a winter, especially if there isn't multiple hard frosts. So that's one of the mechanisms of the midges persisting in the environment and the virus staying in the environment. So if we look at weather data provided by Met Éireann, when we're considering this 12 degree, we can see that the period of high risk really is from May through to October, that the weather is consistently above that 12 degrees. And when we look at this temperature graph in correlation with domestic milk intake, so when the peak milk, it correlates very similarly, which is one of the key reasons why we're talking about Ireland being affected or could potentially be affected with production losses, because the peak milk yield could coincide with peak infection also. The viral load may take a few months to build up. So if you think in May we'd have X number of midges with virus, as they bite more infected animals, as they get, the viral load builds up in the environment as the weather gets warmer, you can imagine the viral load in the environment picks up and increases to its maximum towards that early autumn period in September, October. So clinical signs, what should we be looking out for? So the clinical signs vary greatly, and I'm sure you've heard of the continent. They had severe clinical signs. They saw a lot of deaths in sheep, and they saw a lot of lameness, a lot of mouth lesions, a lot of production losses. But they can vary from everything from no clinical signs all the way through to death. Now, death, the clinical or the mortality losses were actually due to welfare reasons in a lot of cases in the sheep in the Netherlands in the outbreak, because they were just so clinically ill. The kindest thing was to do was to euthanize them. One of the key production losses would be fertility losses, and that can be dependent on the time that the virus gets into the animal, depending if it's early or mid or late gestation. So there can be early embryonic death, or there can be abortions, or you can get dummy calves. These calves with neurological symptoms go around stargazing and never thrive. And that's because the virus attacks a specific part of the developing fetus's brain. Then you can also see the more general clinical signs, so conjunctivitis, crusty nose, they can get lesions around their coronary bands, which leads to lameness. They can get teeth lesions, they can get mouth lesions, which causes an appetite and drooling. And you can imagine if you're a dairy cow or a suckler cow and you go off your feed, that will also lead to production losses. So apologies. So these are some images from the Pirbright Institute of cattle in the Netherlands, where they saw quite severe clinical signs. You can see the nose lesions, the teeth lesions, and the mouth lesions there. So then talking about what the Netherlands saw, so as I said, there was quite significant mortality in their sheep when they first saw this in 2023. And the clinical losses were significant. We can see multiple journal articles showing, really severe economic and production losses in animals in the Netherlands. However, as this disease has moved further west, we can see that in Britain, far fewer clinical signs were reported. And because of that, there was skepticism on the uptake of the vaccine, because farmers considered that the clinical signs were very mild. Now, it is all very dependent on what the summer does. If you get a really warm summer, you get that rapid viral replication, and we could see something similar to the Netherlands picture. And I suppose you need a crystal ball to really to be able to predict, are we going to see the UK picture or are we going to see the Netherlands picture? And it's, in my opinion, it's quite impossible to predict which one it's going to do. So the national situation. So in January, on the 24th of January, a blood came back from the cull cow serosurveillance program. So this is a surveillance program we have running in all our factories, and an antibody positive cow was detected. She was based in a Wexford coastal herd. She actually had been grazing a farm or a field which was right beside the coast, which is where we always suspected that this virus would enter Ireland, given its location close to the southwest of England. So we went back to that farm. We found additional positive animals, and they were positive for both virus and antibodies. So you may hear the terms PCR positive and antibody positive bandied around. PCR positive means that viral material has been detected in the blood. It's a bit of an ambiguous one in terms of it doesn't always mean the animal is infective, because they're infected and they remain infective, which means they can pass on the virus for about 8 weeks. However, the virus has an affinity for the red blood cells, and they need to be cleared by the animal's spleen before the animal can clear the virus totally. And they can remain PCR positive for up to 120 days or even longer. So when you hear PCR positive, it doesn't actually always mean the animal is still infective. And the ones that we detected in January were likely infected back in October, September last year. So by the time they were detected, they were no longer infective to subsequent biting midges. The viral load would have been much too low to infect a subsequent midge. So as we say, we think these midges were blown across the Irish Sea, and we'll look at some nice modelling that was done by colleagues in UCD to support that theory. So what's happened since we've detected it? Now, the Bluetongue, initially it was a cat C disease. Because of the continental experience in trying to eradicate it, this disease is being recategorized to what's called a category D+E disease. And for that reason, along with the fact that we were in this low vector transmission period with the cold weather, the policy was not to pursue an eradication program, not to put zones in place, and not to have any movement restrictions. And that was because they weren't epidemiologically justified for the reasons I've provided. So movements farm to farm through March, etc., are all continuing. The main purpose at the moment, or the main policy objective at the moment, is to try and identify the geographical extent of the cases to assist farmers in decision making as to what they're going to do with their herd prior to that high risk season, which is, looking at May, June time, depending on when our summer comes in. So far we've 10 cases reported to the EU. We have that initial index herd, which is based right here, just east of Enniscorthy. Following the detection of that herd, we performed contiguous herd testing and we found 3 additional positive herds. Following that, we performed herd testing out of the 20-kilometre zone where no additional positives were found. We then scaled back in and performed surveillance testing in the 10-kilometre zone and up the coast where we found an additional 2 positive animals in herds. In addition to that surveillance, we also have a positive which was from an export animal, so an animal that was being exported and required a PCR test prior to export and turned out to be positive. That animal was based in a herd in Kildare. There was also 2 animals following submission of abortion bloods. So one was a fetus that was tested in Kilkenny RVL, and that was a herd based in Arklow. And the second was a post-abortion cow, bloods taken from her, and she was based in a large herd up in Louth. In addition, there was 1 additional cow detected on the cull cow scheme based in Wexford again. So this map here is a map from the Department of the Environment and Farming in the UK. So the DAFM map, the colours denote the density of animals, so both cattle and sheep in the UK. And all these red arrow or red triangles are cases which have occurred since July last year. So we can see as the season progressed last year, the virus travelled west, and we can see this really dense area down in the toe of Cornwall and also a dense area up here in Wales. And these are important because these fit in with Severa's modelling that I'll show you in the next slide. These arrows here dictate the detected cases currently in Ireland. So we have the positive case that was detected in Northern Ireland at the end of last year up in the Ards Peninsula. We have the positive cow that was found in Louth, the Kildare animal, the Arklow animal, and the Wexford animals, all indicated here on the map. So as I said, Severa, who are the Centre for Veterinary Epidemiology and Risk Analysis in UCD, very kindly performed some backwards trajectory modelling. So to perform this, they had to determine all the APHA, so the UK Animal Health and Protection Agency provided all their outbreak data from all the sites in the UK. They then looked at when the temperature was correct, when the humidity was correct, and when the prevailing wind direction was correct and in a laminar flow. So if you have too much wind, midges don't fly, they hunker down. If you have wind that's rising, the midges will be blown up into the atmosphere. So you need a really steady, progressive laminar airflow. It can't be raining because midges, again, hunker down when it's raining. So there's a really specific set of environmental conditions that have to align to enable this midge migration to happen. And researchers don't know why midges migrate, but they do seem to release themselves in clusters when these perfect conditions align. And we can see from this modelling, there was a specific date that all the stars aligned around the 25th of September, which is when infected midges could have blown from the infected area in Cornwall and the infected area in Wales and further north. And if you see where that plume lands, it affects the areas that we've seen. So you're covering Louth, Arklow, Wexford, and also down into Waterford and beyond. And it also accounts for the Ards Peninsula case. In addition, from speaking to Isle of Man colleagues, the Isle of Man have detected antibodies in a significant number in a couple of herds, and they were found again in January this year. So this modelling also would account for that incursion there too. So talking about the temperature exceedance, if we're looking around that time of the September incursion, we can see that temperatures were starting to drop around that time. And this is really important because it explains why we didn't get that secondary transmission. So infected midges from Cornwall blew across to Wexford. They arrived here, they landed, they bit an animal and created a viremia or PCR positive animal. That animal then seroconverted, so we got the antibody positives also. However, the midges weren't able to, the animals didn't develop enough viremia in time for another midge to bite them, so an Irish midge to bite that cow and be able to multiply the virus in them and then bite subsequent animals. So all we see is a really low in-herd prevalence of around 8% of the animals in the herd were infected in those index herds. And that's because, as I said, subsequent midge bites either didn't become viremic or there wasn't enough temperature to enable the viral multiplication within those midges so that they could subsequently bite additional animals. So this is looking at maps. If we look at round that week in September was quite warm, but after that the weather got colder and colder and colder. So as we know, it takes about 20 days at the 12 degrees for that multiplication in midges to happen. So it's looking from this weather maps that the temperature just wasn't there to enable those midges to transmit the virus further. However, as I said, midges can overwinter. And there may be also viremic calves, as I said, calves that are infected in utero and lambs, they can be born with virus. And that's another way that the virus overwinters in the environment. So looking at surveillance, we are currently doing targeted surveillance based on that modelling that I showed you from Severa. We're also doing more broad geographic spread national surveillance. And in addition, there's also private, so export and pre-breeding blood samples being taken too. And we get all that data back so we can then provide a broad geographical spread of the extent of the incursion of this disease. So the targeted surveillance, again, our colleagues in Severa were really helpful here. We looked at that plume of midges that came across in accordance with the modelling. The herd data that those plumes covered was pulled and hexagons were applied at a set distance to ensure spatial differentiation between the herds. So in each of those hexagons, sampling has been carried out. Currently, there's been no positives detected from that surveillance. The animals had to be in residence since mid-September because that's the time of the incursion. And we were requesting that any clinical signs or animals with clinical signs would have been submitted for that testing to try and improve the detection rate. However, as I said, with a really low in-herd prevalence, it is a bit like finding a needle in a haystack. So in terms of policy then, there is no herd restriction. If a positive had been detected, there is no herd restriction. The policy is about determining the geographic spread. It is not about trying to eradicate this disease. As we discussed, the continent have had 3 years of experience in trying to eradicate this and have failed because of the persistence of those vectors in the environment. Again, there was no animal restriction if positives detected. And for the farmer, I suppose you get a real-time snapshot of the immunocompetence of your herd if a positive had been detected. So as I said, in addition, we're also carrying out the abattoir surveillance. So there's 26 abattoirs currently engaged in providing bloods, approximately 1,000 bloods per week. And from that, we have detected 2 more positives. In addition, we're looking for any animals post-abortion to be submitted for BTV analysis also, and any deformed fetuses or dummy calves that are submitted to regional vet labs to also be tested for BTV. There are 3 private labs which are designated for performing private PCR Bluetongue testing, and that's Enfer Farm Labs and Animal Health Laboratories Ireland. So if you want to get private testing done, for instance, on a stock bull to ensure that they're PCR negative prior to the breeding season, you can send it to any of these 3 labs. So we're going to talk about vaccination then, because it's the it's the key risk mitigating factor that you can perform to try and reduce the viremia in a herd. So there's currently 3 Bluetongue vaccines, Bluetongue 3 vaccines licensed in the Irish market. Currently, Boltavo is the only one that is actually available on the shelves. Cybazole is supposed to be available come mid-April, and Bluevac 3, the manufacturers still haven't given us a date as to when it'll be available on the shelves. And this is all commercial decisions as to when they bring their product into Ireland. The vaccines reduce viremia and the clinical signs. Boltavo does have a claim that it can stop viremia altogether. Unfortunately, there's no duration of immunity established yet, and that's really important for certification purposes. So we know that for animals moving into Ireland from a third country, so a non-EU country, or for animals moving, say, to GB, there's a piece in the cert that looks for the vaccine to be administered with the duration of immunity established. And none of these vaccines yet have that established. The companies are indicating that it's going to be an annual vaccine, and they are advising that the duration of immunity should be established soon, but they've been saying that since last November, and we still have no additional information on that. There was a high uptake of BTB3 and BTB8 vaccination across Europe, but that did decrease last year. And last year in GB, there were 4 million BTB3 vaccines sold. So the big question, I suppose, how and when to vaccinate. So in cattle require 2 doses, which are 3 weeks apart. It then takes a further 3 weeks for full immunity to develop. So you're looking at a 6-week period that you have to have that vaccine in the animal prior to the high risk season. So we're looking at, 6 weeks really before that June date. So anywhere from now through April would be the key time to start vaccinating. Sheep are slightly different. It's only a single dose, and immunity is conferred 3 to 4 weeks after that. And again, their high risk period, because you're breeding later in the season, would again be pushed slightly later as well. So in terms of why we would vaccinate, I suppose one of the key reasons is the fertility issues that Bluetongue can cause. And as I said, it depends when the animal becomes infected. But if we think of our tight spring calving pattern, our typical dairy herd in Ireland, you're looking at them being in early gestation between May and June, mid gestation then in sort of mid summer to early autumn, and then late gestation through autumn and winter. This again correlates with when the temperatures are rising. That's what these graphs are there, the last 3 years, 2024, 23, and 22. So we can see those temperatures rising, which means viral load in the environment will rise. So this is your high risk period, being infected mid-gestation, and what that can lead to, as I said, is abortion or dummy calves being born in the next spring season, which will lead to significant economic losses. Secondly, then we're also looking at the production. So again, if you have an animal that's viremic, has a fever, has lameness, mouth ulcers, teeth lesions, that's all going to lead to production losses. And again, this high risk season correlates with our higher milk yields. So how do we get BTB3 vaccines? Your PVP, your veterinary practitioner, has to apply to DAFM for a license. This has all been streamlined significantly in the last couple of weeks. So once the vet applies for a license and is issued, they then can add herds to that license as and when a farmer wants to apply. They used to have that vaccine back, the license back in advance of the prescription being filled, but now a private vet can just notify the department whenever additional farms or additional herd numbers are added. So far, there's been about 160 licenses issued, and 84 practices have prescribed to about 1,200 herds altogether. If you look on www.gov.ie Bluetongue down here, you'll see more information on applying for the vaccine. So we're going to do a quick couple of slides on trade, and I'm sure you've all heard about the derogation which came in on the 6th of March. So the reason a derogation had to be put in place was because animals couldn't meet the standard intra-EU certification requirements because we didn't have that duration of immunity for the BTB3 vaccine. So in order to enable the resumption of trade between Ireland and Northern Ireland, we discussed with our Northern Ireland counterparts, and we put this derogation in place for Bluetongue disease requirements. So every member state in the EU can decide what requirements they want for animals, BTV susceptible animals coming into their country. For Ireland and Northern Ireland, we aligned because it meant then it was harmonised across the island of Ireland, which made sense epidemiologically. So from our perspective, we have BTV3 here. We don't want the other BTV serotypes. Therefore, we applied a derogation where if a country or if a member state only has BTV3, then there is no requirements in relation to BTV on the cert. However, if there are other serotypes circulating, so the BTV 8, 1, 5, 12, etc., then the animal has to have quite strict pre-movement testing to prove immunity. So they have to either been vaccinated or have to have a specific antibody to each serotype that's been reported in that member state. And they have to be virus negative, so that PCR negative. And that's a real sort of risk mitigating step to try and prevent the incursion of additional serotypes into Ireland. However, it has to also be said that the disease situation on the continent is very different to that in Ireland. We know they've got lumpy skin disease circulating throughout France and Spain and Italy. We've got foot and mouth disease now in Cyprus and Greece. So there's always an inherent risk of importing live animals. And I think everyone should be really, really aware of that risk and really consider it strongly before deciding to import live animals from continental Europe. In relation to other member states, all their derogations can be found online. So this website here, it's movements within the EU. Each member state has explained what derogations they have in place for the movement of animals. So for instance, say the Netherlands, because they also have BTV3, they have no requirements for other member states which have only BTV3. So therefore animals going from here to the Netherlands have no additional requirements. I'm just going to do a really quick word on the recategorization because I sort of mentioned this a couple of times as to why we didn't go down the eradication route. So Bluetongue has been classified from a category C disease to what's called a category D+E disease. And what this means is we can no longer have official disease-free status of a country. And eradication is no longer going to be a possibility. It's with Bluetongue. And the reason is 3 years of experience on the continent has shown that eradication doesn't work. And that could be linked to climate change and the persistence of the midges in the environment. So they're getting better at overwintering and then resurgence of virus as soon as the weather picks up. And also the increased heat and humidity has meant they persist for much longer in the environment also. So come July, there'll be no further eradication. There'll be a very different set of EU rules in relation to BTV. Those certs haven't yet been produced, but it looks like there'll be a 150-kilometre area around a Bluetongue virus case, which means that Ireland and Northern Ireland will likely be within these. They're not really restriction zones, but they are 150-kilometre areas where some certification will apply out of such an area. However, derogations will still apply. So I would say the status quo will continue come July, but we are awaiting the publication of those certs. So that is everything I'm going to discuss today. So I'll try and answer any questions you might have now.
Thanks very much, Ruth. That was a very, very comprehensive cover of Bluetongue. I'll just ask a couple of questions first before I go to Sean. Just a couple of questions I have myself. It's BTV3 is the virus that's in Ireland at the moment. Am I correct on that, Ruth? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and we just say, for argument's sake, I'm a farmer and I vaccinate against that particular strain, and I do my cows now over the next number of weeks. We'll say, could it be the case, or what? I know it's probably a hypothetical question. I presume other forms of the virus may come into the country, or what's your view on that?
Look, yeah, the UK have BTV8. They also had a case of BTV12. So there are two separate serotypes. Unfortunately, there's no cross protection between the serotypes. They're all quite distinct viruses. So even if you're vaccinated against BTV3, the animal is susceptible to BTV8. The purpose of the derogation and requiring those really stringent pre-movement tests is to try and do everything possible to keep it out. But obviously importing a positive animal is only one risk factor. There is always the possibility of BTV8 spreading across the UK and also blowing across similar to how BTV3 did. However, epidemiologically, BTV3 spread much more quickly, much more rapidly across GB than the BTV8, which is more in isolated pockets. I don't know why, maybe an epidemiologist could explain that, but I think the most we can do is to prevent importing animals from countries where there's other serotypes circulating to try and keep it out of the country.
Okay, thanks very much, Ruth. Um, just another question there. If an animal becomes infected with blue tongue, we just said they become infected, do they have antibodies, or do they become immune? Is that for all of their life, or is that for a number of months, or what way does that work?
So natural immunity, absolutely. They seroconvert. It takes the usual about 2 to 3 weeks for the antibodies to rise and for the animal to what we call seroconversion, which means that there's antibodies in the blood when you test it. Natural immunity, again, there's limited research, but it's estimated to last about 18 months to 2 years. So you get this peak of antibodies and a peak of immunity, and then it starts waning. So it looks like a sort of 2 year waxing waning cycle where the animal can come infected again 2 years later and then build up antibodies again, etc. So natural immunity is absolutely, as with most viruses, it is a possibility.
But I suppose the danger is if they contact a disease when they're pregnant or in that pregnancy stage, is that you can have huge issues with abortions, etc.
Well, that's it. If an animal is infected in sort of early to mid gestation, and before they build up that immune response, that virus can already have attacked the fetus and created the neurological signs, or early embryonic death, or cause the animal to abort. So yeah, that's the risk.
And just another question myself there, Ruth, is like Bluetongue, obviously it's on the east coast at the moment, and we're over kind of Midlands, west side of the country. Um, I suppose just again, I suppose it's your opinion. Do you see a case where we'll see Bluetongue possibly in every county in the next number of months when the temperature rises above 12 degrees? Is that kind of what you're envisaging?
I think it's inevitable, Charlie. Yeah, like it blew here from Cornwall. So if it can cross the Irish Sea, what's stopping it crossing the Irish countryside? Um, whether it be this summer or sort of towards the tail end of the season, I don't know. I can't predict. The other key factor as well is the amount of animal movement in Ireland that we all know. And as I said, because the in-herd prevalence is quite low, and because currently none of the cases that we've seen exhibited any clinical signs, so these were all sort of silent carriers of disease. Um, there could be positive animals already sitting over in Galway, sitting up in Sligo, and it's just going to take that midge population and the temperature rise for a midge to bite that animal and potentially spread disease. So
Okay. And then just the last question I haven't said before we come to Sean is just the beef welfare scheme. I know you mentioned there we were chatting beforehand. That this would be one of the vaccines that will be covered under that scheme, as from what you were saying.
yes, I apologize. As predicted, I forgot to mention it. So yeah, the
Yeah.
minister announced yesterday that the Bluetongue vaccine will be included in both the beef welfare scheme and the national sheep welfare scheme.
Thanks, Ruth. Now, Sean, I know Sean has questions there from the audience, so
Yeah,
no further
thanks.
ado.
Thanks for that, Charlie. Yeah, there are a number of questions that came through there, and a number of people thanking you for your excellent presentation there, Ruth, as well. So, first question there, would you recommend vaccinating non-breeding beef cattle that would be finished off grass, we'll say in October, November?
It's a really difficult question. And I suppose it's all about it's all about risk appetite. If we were saying yes, we're absolutely going to get the Netherlands experience, then I'd be saying yes. However, if we get that UK experience and what we've seen to date with minimal clinical signs, it's the production losses in finishing cattle may be milder, maybe less. You're not getting that economic loss of having an empty cow or a dummy calf in next spring. So look, it's a difficult decision. I think the risk is lower than it is with your high value breeding animals and your sort of spring calving pattern herd.
Okay. Um, will vaccine be available in smaller bottle sizes for smaller herds? Currently,
Yeah, I
yeah.
know this issue's been brought up a lot, and unfortunately, it's a commercial decision by the manufacturers to only supply the 50 ml bottles to Ireland. Um, that's really one that pressure has to come on from purchasing customers to say, to issue the demand for smaller vial sizes. But current discussions with the vaccine companies is that only 50 mils will be available. Now, prescribing vets can split them. However, we know there's a 10-hour window once a vial is broached that the vaccine has to be used. So it would take pretty significant coordination between a number of farmers to all agree to vaccinate on the same day. If you want to do 10 animals from one herd, 30 animals from another herd, etc. It can be done, vials can be split, but it will take a coordinated effort to do it. And you have to be really strict on the biosecurity as well when extracting the vaccines to ensure there's a biosecurity protection between each farm.
Okay. Can lepto and Bluetongue vaccine be given together?
Yes, yeah. So it's the same as any vaccine, I suppose. They can be given together. There's no evidence to show that they affect each other. Anyone I've spoken to and any other vets I've spoken to have said, look, they don't think any more than two vaccines should be administered at any time to a cow, um, because you're stressing their immune system. So it doesn't matter which two vaccines, but it should be kept to sort of minimum two vaccines at any stage of vaccination.
Okay, and I suppose if people were giving them to younger stock, maybe pneumonia vaccine or black leg vaccine, the same would apply.
Same,
Yeah.
same would apply, yeah.
Someone's asked, are you advising to vaccinate in the West? So you probably have covered that. So
Again, look, I know it sounds like, I suppose, a cop out to say you need to discuss the risk with your private vets, and it really depends on your herd type, your calving pattern, your value of your herd, your breeding animals, etc. And it is, unfortunately, it's on a case by case basis and the risk appetite. I think if I was a gambling person, I would say I would imagine the virus will be over west towards the tail end of the summer. What I can't predict is the severity of the clinical signs. And that's the big issue. That's sort of the risk appetite piece of it, is what you're willing to um what you're willing to gamble on what the clinical signs might be.
okay, if I were to import a ram from Northern Ireland, what do I need to do?
So the derogation is in place for this free movement of animals. So it's standard as it was prior to detecting Bluetongue in Northern Ireland. So it'll be an intracert. Um, so the OV in the Northern Ireland will certify the ram and it'll move down. There'll be no post-import testing, and there'll be no requirements in relation to Bluetongue virus.
Okay, is it a good time to vaccinate sheep now, or is it too soon, given that the breeding season will be later in the year?
Yeah, so again, another good question. And this is one where the duration of immunity hasn't been established. However, the vaccine companies are saying it is an annual vaccine. So even if you vaccinate breeding animals, breeding sheep now, they should still be covered for August, September, October time. However, it is there is that question that you could actually leave it later in the season as long as you're 6 weeks prior to them starting tupping. However, I would probably be vaccinating rams now because they can develop a viremia and then spread that in the semen for up to 8 weeks. So that'd be the high risk, the highest risk animal, I suppose, in that scenario would be a ram.
Okay, a few more. There's kind of two questions. One, when is the most ideal time to vaccinate heifers from a mating perspective? And is there any risk from vaccinating cows, heifers that are recently in calf? So what's the ideal time to vaccinate heifers from a mating perspective?
So again, 6 weeks before high risk season. As with all vaccines, you'd want to be, I suppose, giving a bit of time separation prior to breeding, just in case they develop that, a transient fever after vaccination, same as humans can get. But it has to be at least 6 weeks before that high risk season. So you're looking at the high risk season being June, July. So you'd be wanting to put vaccines in them from sort of now, April time.
Okay.
Um, the vaccines are all safe to use in breeding animals and to use in pregnant animals.
Okay. Does the vaccination have any risk on bull fertility?
Interesting question, and one we've been asked a good bit. we've talked to our UCD colleagues, and they have said there's no research showing a decrease in fertility. Again, with any vaccination, you can get a very transient drop in semen quality in the week following vaccination. However, the AI stations where that research was performed said the semen quality was still of acceptable standard. So it was basically a slight reduction in motility.
Um, how many cattle will a 50 ml bottle cover?
So that's a good question. I think it is 1 mil. I'll have to double check that. Apologies, I don't know that one off the
Okay.
top of my head.
Yeah, I think it is, Charlie, if you came across that, I think it is.
I think it's 1 mil per animal for the
Yeah,
Bultavo.
as far as we're aware, yeah, it's 1 mil per animal.
I
Yeah,
think, yeah,
that's
yeah.
that.
Is there any negative production losses associated with the vaccine?
No.
No. Okay. Um, do flight treatments, such as morons, reduce the risk of animals contracting the disease? I suppose maybe even the likes of the garlic licks or that sort of thing to keep the fly away.
Yeah, I know, and I suppose there is no evidence that insecticide use is effective against biting midges. And as I said to everyone, like you know yourself, working in the summer, regardless of how much insecticide you put, or OTAN, etc., you put on yourself, you still get bitten. And I know clients with horses who have sweet itch, which is also caused by the Culicoides midge. You know, they spend thousands and they keep them indoors and rugged and all the rest, and the midges still bite them. Like they're very, very difficult to deter from animals. So there's no evidence insecticides work.
Okay. Are cattle and sheep the only animals affected?
Nope, it's all ruminants. So you're talking about cattle, sheep, goats, alpacas, camelids. So yeah, ruminants.
Okay.
Deer
Um,
as well.
this one you probably have covered. Should you vaccinate a ram 6 weeks before tubbing?
Yes. Sheep is one dose, so they develop immunity about 3 to 4 weeks after the shot. So it's a shorter window for them.
Okay. And the last question, is there a shortage of vaccines? Some vets are putting farmers on a waiting list.
Okay. Not that I had been made aware of. As I said, Boltavo is the only one currently available, the Boehringer vaccine. Cybazil should be coming on the market in April. Last time we talked to the Boehringer, they said they'd upped the number of doses. I think they had 600,000 pen for the Irish market, and that had been increased to something like 1.2 million. So it is a supply and demand. You know, it's a commercial decision. So the more demand there is, the more those companies will choose to bring the product in. And as I said, I hadn't been made aware that there was a shortage. And I spoke to my the veterinary medicines colleagues yesterday on this, and they hadn't been made aware of it either. So
Okay. Okay. That's all the questions covered there now.
super.
Yeah, thanks very much, Sean, and thanks very much, Ruth. And I think very again covered off very comprehensively. I think thanks to everybody for all their questions. So Ruth, as I say, a very comprehensive presentation. Any final words you'd like to give before say we move on to the end of the webinar? Would like
Just to say that
yeah.
there is more information on the Bluetongue website, and any questions we are happy to answer if you send them to the email address, which is ndccbtv@agriculture.gov.ie. We'll get back to anybody who sends any queries to that email address.
Okay. Well, thanks again, Ruth, and I hope that the presentation is a good use to everybody because I believe the topic is kind of with the climate at the moment and the fact we're under the 12 degrees, as Ruth would have stated in her presentation, we may not be seeing the full activity yet, and again from what Ruth is saying, we'll see a lot more activity as the months go on as we move into summer. So we hope that the advice given now will help people guide and protect their animals through over that season. And again, thanks to Sean for fielding the questions, and thanks to everybody who gave in questions into the webinar. And again, thanks to everybody who attended. So bye for now, and the best of luck with your farming over the season ahead.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Bye bye.
Thanks.